Welcome back to another episode of the Engineering Future Podcast. I'm your host, Luis Duque, and this week I bring you part 2 of the presentation from Robert Smith about ethics and some real-world examples about good ethical engineers and not so ethical engineers. And if you haven't heard part 1 of this series, I really encourage you to go back, listen to the episode. It's a really good example of a good ethical engineer who overlooked some of the loading scenarios kind of in the design, but then decided to basically fix it, and thankfully everything was okay and nothing really major happened. In this episode, we're going to go over a few bad examples of engineers who knew they were doing something wrong and decided not to fix the problem, which was definitely not the right decision. We also hear from him about a young engineer who was put in a really tough situation from an unethical boss that cost him his license for a few months, even a few years, because he was afraid to speak up. And I know as young engineers, we are still a little inexperienced in this sense, but we need to realize and we need to be well educated in terms of ethics so we do not commit those mistakes and we're put in this tough situation by supervisors or bosses that may not be acting ethically. And we should know about it and act accordingly. So thank you so much for coming back to this episode. Make sure you subscribe to the newsletter at luisfelipeduque.com/newsletter. I've been getting a lot of great messages from all of you, a lot of great comments and just praise for the podcast, and that's been amazing to hear. I'm glad that this podcast is helping you in your careers and just learn more about some of the great engineers and what they're doing and some of the ways we as young engineers in general, I'm still learning through these conversations, we can become better engineers. So if you are new to the channel, make sure you subscribe. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast and enjoy the content. Please rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts. It really helps get the word out there. It really helps new engineers find the show, and it helps me overall to keep growing this community of engineering our future. And honestly, it's been amazing to have all of you be part of this journey. So without further ado, let's jump right into the conversation with Robert. Welcome to the Engineering Our Future Podcast, a podcast where I bring you relevant content from personal experience and guests to help young engineers, students, and international students succeed in their careers.
Next, I think we'll talk about the famed Pinto case, the Ford Pintos. Back in the 1970s, small cars were coming out to compete with the foreign imports, and Ford came out with the Pinto that they rushed in the design and the manufacture, and they were fine for what you paid for them. And this is before the internet, and back in the days when people paid for long distance calls, so most calls were local. So we didn't have cell phones, we didn't have the internet. But a group of lawyers were at a plaintiff's attorney's conference, and they were talking, and one of them said he had a case where Pinto was rear-ended and burst into flames and the people were severely scarred. Well, the other lawyer said, I got one of those too, and there's another one that I know of. And a third lawyer there said, I don't have any of those cases, but I know someone who does. So it was a big convention. They started asking around, and this was not uncommon, that these Pintos, when being rear-ended, would burst into flames. So they started a class action suit, and in the discovery, this is a sad day for the engineering profession. They found that Ford was aware of the problem. They did an economic analysis. So they knew how many Pintos they had sold. They knew the accident rate that caused fires. And from those, they knew the death rate. They knew the rates of people scarred, burned. And they knew what those lawsuits or what they would settle. And they did a calculation as to what it would cost to fix the problem and what it would cost to pay off the lawsuits. It was a lot cheaper to pay off the losses. Of course, Ford denied this entered into their thinking process. But what they were saying was, no, we value human life. We value people being scarred for life. We value that bottom line more. And they denied it. But the fix was basically to build a metal casing around the back of the fuel tank, which was in the rear near the bumper. So in an accident, it wouldn't come in and shatter it. And subsequently, somebody who worked at Ford was in their recall division, and they would evaluate data and statistics. He wrote an article about it. And his contention was that they didn't see it as being that big a problem, and that the issue was happening with other makes of that similar sized car. And they attributed it to the small size of the car, not to their design flaw. But it goes down as one of the case histories of what not to do. But do we learn from it? And the automotive industry seems to be one of the worst offenders. More recently, in the 2010s, we had the GMC ignition matter. The engineers at GMC were given the charge to redo the ignition system, make it better, and make it cheaper. Well, they achieved one of the two. It actually brings to mind an old engineering saying that in engineering you can get things cheap, you can get things good, and you can get things fast. But you can only get two of the three at any given time. Well, when they were doing the redo of the ignition system, they made it cheaper, they didn't make it better. And the electrical part that was put in was larger than the previous one. So the springs in the ignition switch had to be changed, and they put in smaller springs. What would happen is people would be driving down the highway. If they had extra keys on their key ring or a rabbit's foot, a beer opener, they could pull the keys out of the ignition. It would kill the motor, and people would panic. And if they were in an accident, the airbags would not deploy, because they won't come on if the engine is not running. GMC learned of this. They went back and they redesigned the switch. Never told anybody. And the real smoking gun is when they redesigned the switch. They didn't give it a new part number. In the automotive industry, anytime you change a part in the least, it gets a new number. They didn't do it, so when the recall finally came, nobody knew for a certain year which cars had the defective switch and which didn't, and that didn't help matters. I served on the Rhode Island Board of Registration for over 20 years and was the principal investigator in most of our discipline cases. And one of the things that I did find was people usually knew what the right thing was to do and what the wrong thing was, but they chose not to do it. And that's where the ethics has to come into it. I'll share the story of a young man against whom a disciplinary complaint was filed at the Board of Registration. And this is all public record. I'm not going to mention any names, but he worked for a small surveying firm as the in-house engineer on subdivisions, etc. and it was a slow time in the economy. So he would find things to keep him out of the office because he didn't want to be sitting around strumming on the old banjo, bring attention to the fact he didn't have a lot to do. And one morning the phone rang, his boss answered it, and it was a wealthy individual who was building a Hummer house, a McMansion, and they were having structural issues with it. It was wood frame construction, and when they would open the doors, the entire house would shake, and the contractor told them, well, once the drywall goes up, that'll lock it in. When the drywall went up, they were still having issues, and there were other things that were bouncing around. So the doctor had decided to fire the contractor and not pay his open bill until he found out what it was going to cost to remedy. Hired a new contractor, and the new contractor said, you're going to have to get an engineer in here. We'll take down the drywall so they can see everything, get it figured out. But they're going to have to tell me what I have to do to fix it. So this doctor called on that particular day, and the young man's boss was there. He says, oh, we have an engineer here who's a specialist in wood framing. Those are rare, hard to find. Most structural engineers, if they do it, it's as a specialty. And the doctor said it's going to be for an arbitration. He said, I'm not paying the guy's bill. As a matter of fact, I'm probably going to need money back from him according to my contractor. So we'll need to know what needs to be done, and the contractor will price it out. You won't have to. He said, and his boss says, well, right now he's not here. Coincidentally, he's out looking at something very similar. I'll have him call you when he gets in. The young man arrived at work. His boss told him, you got to call this doctor, and you got to tell him you're experienced in arbitrations. He says, I'm not. He said, you know the last 2 times we were sued, you had to go testify, those were arbitrations, so you're experienced. And tell him that you're an expert in wood framing. He says, well, I'm not. He says, well, buy a book, become an expert. He says, there isn't a lot for you to do around here right now. We finally have something to come in that we can bill on. And you'll give me your excuses why you can't do it. He says, now go call the guy. Calls the doctor, goes up, meets with him. Says, I'll have to write you a proposal. Goes back, tells his boss, I don't think I'm qualified for this. His boss says, well, you tell me you're not qualified, period. So he writes a proposal, they fax it to the doctor. Doctor signs it. Now he has to get going. He goes up there and really doesn't know even what he's looking at. And he was the only engineer in the office, didn't have anyone to speak to. Was not active in any of the engineering societies. I'm going to put on a different hat right now. I've been the senior advisor to the ASCE Rhode Island section, getting close to 30 years now. And I make almost all the meetings. I recommend everyone does. One, you network. And when I owned my firm, I did pick up work. That's not why I did it. But more than that, I met people. I found out what their area of expertise was. If I had a question in an area, I could call someone. He didn't have that open to him. So he goes up with one of the surveyors with a video cam, and they're going through this, and the surveyor is videotaping him, and they're up in the attic, and he's shaking things. And he said, I don't think it should be shaking like that. And he looks at the grade stamp on the lumber. It says KDSP. And he says, oh wow, it's Southern Pine. That's really strong. KDSP is kiln-dried spruce. You can't get anything worse. Well, maybe if it's made out of balsa wood. That's the stuff they sell in the big box stores usually. You would normally frame it using hemp fur. And so this was on the videotape. And he started asking the contractor, well, what do you think should be done here? What do you think should be done with this? What do you think's wrong? And the contractor said to me, hey kid, you're supposed to tell me. I'm not supposed to tell you. If I knew what to do, I would do it. So he went back, and he was told he had to submit something by the end of the week to the arbitrator. And the arbitrator was dual degreed. He was an engineer, and then he went over to the dock side, became a lawyer. So he was going to be well versed. He didn't have anything to send him, so he sent him the videotape. And the lawyer / engineer sent back a note that you have to give me chapter, book, and verse from the building code. Excuse me. And cite the violations. I need your calculations. I'll need them before the arbitration next week. So you'll have till Monday to submit them. The arbitration's on Wednesday. So faced with that, he did the only thing he could think of at the time. No, he didn't consider suicide. He went and told his boss, things are really slow, so why don't I take my vacation time now? So when things pick up again, I'll have it out of the way. His boss says, good idea. So the following Wednesday, they get a call from the arbitrator asking where the engineer is. And his boss says, oh, he's on vacation for 2 weeks. He must not have known. The arbitrator's saying, yeah, he knew. So his decision was that the first contractor would be paid $70,000, and the first contractor wouldn't have to give anything back. They're expecting back about 50 grand. So there's going to be a swing of about $120,000. The doctor went to a lawyer. Matter of fact, it was the lawyer who represented the arbitration. And he said, there's got to be a board that regulates these people. So they filed a complaint. I was the investigator on it. And the young man wasn't returning the calls, so I got one side of the story. And he had gone to his boss now, and he was really upset. He said, I told you I didn't want to do it. He says, it'll be all right. He says, I'll have the lawyer who represents the company represent you in front of the board. And that way you won't have any expenses. And he's very good, and he has political connections. He knows some of these guys. So he came in with the lawyer, and the lawyer basically threw him under the bus because he wasn't there representing the young man. He was there representing the firm because they knew a lawsuit was coming. They were going to get ready for the slap shot. And we realized what was going on, and partway through, the young man realized what was going on. So we took all that into account, and he was disciplined for practicing outside his area of his expertise. We could have been a lot harsher on him. And we gave him 3 to 6 months for a suspension. And they had to run an ad in the Providence Journal in the business section, back when the Province Journal had a business section. They had run a classified ad saying that he had been suspended and giving the dates. Well, that happened, and his firm had been doing work for a community, designing a pier for them. And he was supposed to appear in front of the planning board in that town to field any questions and get input. And it was going to be a night meeting, and it was after the suspension had been noticed. And Murphy's Law, it was the day after the ad appeared in the newspaper. And he told his boss he couldn't go. His license was suspended. And his boss was nice, told him, said, you know, you're worth even less to me now not being registered because you can't stamp anything. You can go because you're not doing engineering work. You're doing answers and questions based on what you had done while you were registered. So you can go. So he went. And there were other engineers at the meeting. And there was an engineer on the board. And next morning I went into my office, and my voicemail, I had 3 voicemails from 3 engineers who'd been at the meeting, telling me that they had seen the ad in the Projo, and he was there practicing that night. And we got a couple of calls at the Board of Registration. We got the minutes of the meeting, and we called him in. And this time he came with his own lawyer, and he came with his wife, and his wife came with their infant daughter, babe in arms, to sit by him. And he told us that his boss basically threatened him that if he didn't go, and his boss told him it was okay to go because he wasn't going to be practicing engineering, he was just doing questions and answers on what he had done. And we asked him, didn't that give you cause for concern? And he said, yeah. He said, but he has a wife and a young baby and a mortgage, and he didn't think he could tell his boss no and not get fired, so he did it. And we were easy on him again. We gave him a concurrent 6-month suspension to run with the first. And after the meeting, I went over and I told him how much we had been easy on him, and that he could have lost his license for good. And I said, you've got to get to a place in your profession where you're not dependent upon having to take orders from an unreasonable boss. And I said, nothing good's going to come of it. You can get your license back in about another 5 months. And what's he going to make you do next? So during that time, he went to work for a bigger firm, got his license back, and eventually, as a result of this incident, he chose to leave engineering and go into another science-based profession. And the moral and the takeaway from this is, if it feels wrong, don't do it. You have to be careful, and you have to think it out, think it through. Because if you're told to do something by your immediate superior, and you tell him why you don't want to do it, or tell her why you don't want to do it, then you put yourself in the position that if they tell you to go ahead and do it, you have to go over their head. If you go over their head and whoever you go to agrees with your superior, you're in a tough spot. And if they agree with you, you're still in a tough spot. So it's not an easy thing to do, and it can have repercussions and ramifications. But you never do wrong by doing right. Thank you.